That's the first time I've heard the voice of God in this room. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Jim Heiser, and this is the fourth session in this semester's series of education policy colloquia. And it's sponsored, as you know, by the Program in Education Policy and Governance here at Kennedy School, and under the leadership of Paul Peterson and Marty West. Today we're meeting here in Taubman, as we do on most Thursdays, hopefully sort of every Thursday through, except for vacations, through most of April. And we're also streaming online via Zoom. And as you heard, it's being recorded as we speak. And our schedule is posted on the website. I think we have some on the table here, so you can see what's coming up. We'll be meeting every Thursday. And next week's session features Tom Kane at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who will be sharing his updated research on COVID learning loss and recovery based on the Education and Recovery Report Card that was published just last month by the Center for Education Policy and Research, which Tom founded, and which he is currently the faculty director. And today's topic is tutoring, which is actually connected to Tom's work, since he cites high-impact tutoring as one of the more effective strategies to accelerate student learning. And I use the word accelerate on purpose because our speaker today is Dr. Matthew Steinberg, who is the Managing Director of Research and Evaluation at a nonprofit organization called Accelerate. Matthew will give us more detail on the mission and the work of Accelerate, but in brief, it's an organization dedicated to supporting and promoting evidence-based policies and programs for effective learning interventions with a particular focus on tutoring. According to surveys by the School Pulse Panel, only about half of schools report being able to provide tutoring to all their students who need it. In other words, there's more demand than supply. And importantly, about half of the tutoring that is being offered is funded, at least in part, through federal grants, much of which has been financed with the COVID-era ESSER dollars, which, as you know, have now expired. Here in Massachusetts, the state has provided a few $1 million per year over the last several years, mostly funded by ESSER, to support tutoring for a few thousand students. Governor Maura Healey has proposed a new $25 million fund to use state dollars to expand evidence-based tutoring in the Commonwealth, but that, of course, is pending with the legislature. Perhaps more important than the quantity of tutoring is the wide variation in quality and efficacy, even with programs that provide daily tutoring sessions. Hence the need for organizations like Accelerate and people like Matthew to ensure that the dollars that are being allocated to tutoring are being well spent. As I said earlier, Dr. Matthew Steinberg is the Managing Director of Research and Policy at Accelerate. Prior to joining Accelerate, Matthew was an Associate Professor of Education and Public Policy at George Mason University. He received his PhD in Public Policy from the University of Chicago. He was a former New York City teaching fellow and even did a stint in investment banking. I guess that didn't go so well, which is why you're here. But maybe we'll hear more about that later, but I doubt it. After Matthew's comments, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. We'll give priority to folks in the room, but for the folks who are Zooming in online, if you've got questions, please put them into the chat and I'll try to enter you into the conversation as well. As always, as I said earlier, this is being recorded and will be posted on the PEPG website, so this is all on the record. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to Matthew Steinberg.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thank you again. Thanks for everyone for taking their lunchtime to join us today. As Jim said, I started at Accelerate about 1.5 years ago as the first Managing Director of Research and Evaluation, which means what? Which means I work with our research partners, who I'll talk about in a few minutes, and our grantees to design and implement evaluations of tutoring, both in terms of studying the implementation as well as the impact of those tutoring efforts. And what I want to talk a little bit today about is sort of what we know from the existing evidence base on the impact of tutoring in U.S. public schools, right? How we know it, so the evidence base and the methods by which we're able to say, to some extent definitively, that tutoring does work, and largely what remains unknown. So sort of mapping out a research agenda, hopefully some of the graduate students and others in the room and online may be interested in pursuing. So just a bit of an overview of where we're going to go, I guess, in the next 30 minutes. I'm going to give a little bit, as Jim said, a background on what we do at Accelerate, our mission, and the work that we're involved in tutoring. Talk a little bit about the tutoring landscape. What does the demand for tutoring look like relative to the need? And Jim sort of outlined from the school polls panel, sort of the demand and who's using tutoring. And I'll talk a little bit more about that relative to the need, given the recent NAEP results. Then I'll turn to the existing evidence. Again, what do we know about the impact of tutoring? How do we know it? And how does it compare to other educational interventions? And then focusing on what I call the known unknowns, right? Not what I call, but what has been called the known unknowns, which is what are these questions that are still outstanding to really drill down on a series of questions around the design and impact of tutoring in the United States. And finally, I was thinking, I talked with Jim last week, and I've been thinking about this a lot, bringing all of the sort of demand and supply side features together in sort of a very stylized note on what it would take to scale effective tutoring practices nationally in terms of the monetary resources as well as other parameters. So I'll sort of end with that, and hopefully that inspires some discussion, questions, thoughts around the scaling of effective tutoring practices. So a bit about Accelerate. In terms of our theory of action, right? What we do is we provide grants to tutoring providers and states. So we have a call to effective action grant program. We're in the third cycle of that in the 24-25 school year. And we also provide grants to states in our States Leading Recovery Grant Program. We just announced our second round of state grants. And the goal through this grant making is to incentivize not just adoption of tutoring practices, but the design of studies to understand what are the effective practices and strategies, right, to improve learning, particularly for students in underserved communities nationally. So we believe if we identify cost-effective interventions, right, that improve student achievement through rigorous research partnerships with our external research partners like Lisa and CEPR here at Harvard, right, and we're able through our policymaking work, not policymaking work, through our policy advising work, to drive adoption of these interventions in schools and generate the conditions, the funding conditions, the regulatory conditions to support tutoring, then we believe that we can reach the millions of students. And again, I'll talk about the scope of the need and the scope of the demand, the millions of students that are academically behind in this country that need academic supports in the form of tutoring. So in terms of our role, right, in terms of what the value proposition of Accelerate is, we really sit at this intersection of research, practice, and policy. Right? Our practice side, as I mentioned, is through grant making, incentivizing and providing support for tutoring providers, state education agencies, and local education agencies to implement tutoring and then to study those efforts, right? To develop evidence that informs and motivates the field, right? To really prioritize interventions like tutoring that can improve student outcomes, right? With the greatest return on the invested dollar. And then finally, through our policymaking work, developing, as I mentioned, funding and regulatory structures, right, to support the implementation of tutoring at the state and local levels. And just in terms of the work that we've done over the last 3 years. So as I mentioned, we've got two types of grant programs. We've got the call to effective action. We're now in the third year, the 24-25. We also have our States Leading Recovery. Our first cohort we made in 23-24. We just finished that first cohort. That was Arkansas, Louisiana, Ohio, Delaware, and Colorado. We just announced our second SLR grant, which will commence in the fall for the 2-year cycle. And I've sorted these different program types across the number of providers that we're working with and the types of studies that we support. So you can see we've worked with 87 different providers over the last 2.5 years. Right? Focused both on implementation studies. So what are the conditions by which tutoring is implemented, right? To what extent can we maximize dosage? What are the conditions, again, that tutoring takes place, and understanding those settings in which tutoring happens. So, and building some initial correlational evidence. We've got 35 of those studies over this time period. And then on the impact side, we sorted these into sort of quasi-experimental designs, which is sort of loose, right? Because most of these QEDs, if I'm being honest, are propensity score match, which as an economist and others in the room might say that's not a QED, and I would tend to agree. So we're really pushing our QED side really, on the sort of regression discontinuity or even panel-based methods to try to get traction from non-random assignment of tutoring. We've got 23 QEDs in the field over this period, and notably, almost 29 randomized controlled trials of distinct tutoring providers in the field. So as we think about how are we building evidence, right? We're building evidence along this research continuum, right? Understanding the settings and the conditions by which tutoring is implemented in authentic school settings, right? Through our implementation work, and then really trying to drill down on what's the impact of tutoring on average across providers, right? And really pushing forward in our next round of grants and working with folks like Lisa right now in the field, designing multi-armed RCTs, right? To not just get at what's the average effect of a given program or provider, but what are the specific program design features, right? Is it student-tutor ratio? Is it dosage, right? Is it tutor type that's driving the outcomes that we might see as we think about scaling effective practice? So that's really the distribution of the work that we're doing in the field right now. And again, looking forward, we will be bringing on a new cohort of call to effective action grantees for 25-26. And we'll be announcing in the next couple of weeks our first call to effective technology. We're going to be focused on supporting AI-enabled tools in the tutoring and personalized learning space. So be on the lookout for those new announcements. So what does tutoring in the United States look like broadly? Well, when we think about tutoring, we're really talking about a specific type of tutoring, right? This isn't after-school tutoring. This isn't tutoring at Huntington Learning Centers, right? It's what we define as sort of high-dosage tutoring, right? And there's research out there by Matt Kraft and colleagues, this sort of canonical now meta-analysis by Nick Cal and Oriopoulos, as well as folks at the at NSSA, at Stanford under Susanna Loeb's leadership, which defined as Accelerate does high-dosage tutoring by the following criteria. It's personalized, right? The student-tutor ratios are low, typically no more than 4 students in a group. It's intensive, 3 to 5 sessions per week for at least 30 to 60 minutes per session, right? Tutoring is sustained over a long period of time, certainly within a school year. Over at least 36 weeks, though, there are effective programs that are a minimum of 10 weeks, 10 to 15 weeks. And what we write about in and we have a quarterly research note that we publish, and we'll be publishing our 4th one next week, is one of the key bits around the impact of tutoring is that it is sustained and the dosage meets the intended or adequate levels of dosage. And when we see impacts that aren't statistically different from 0, most of those evaluations tend to have very limited dosage relative to intended. So the sustained piece is such a key dimension of ensuring effective implementation and ultimately impact of tutoring. It's based on high quality instructional materials, right? That incorporates direct instruction using these HQIM resources and formative assessments that are aligned with the tier 1 content, right? This is not homework, right? This is truly identifying where students are relative to grade level standards and meeting students' needs to accelerate learning so that we can meet grade level standards. And it happens during the school day. As I mentioned, it's not after school. Right? Why? Because it largely is about an access and equity issue, right? We know that students or that tutoring that happens after the school day tends not to meet the needs of the students that need those services the most, because they tend not to be able, for lots of reasons, right, to not be able to participate. But are we? Yeah, question, please.
Well, quick clarification.
Please.
So, but it is something that you didn't put the remedial basis, right? Like for students that are left behind compared to grade.
Right. So these are right. So we typically identify students based on need, right? Students that are lagging behind grade level standards. So of course, we could view it not just from a remediation perspective, but from an acceleration perspective as well, when provided to students who are at or above grade level. Yeah. Right. So what does the demand, and Jim talked a little bit about this in his opening remarks, what does the demand for tutoring in the US look like? And looking at that same school pulse panel, which I don't know how long that website is going to remain up at this point, but as of October 2024, 37% of public schools nationally offered high dosage tutoring. Right? In those schools offering high dosage tutoring, 25% of students on average received high dosage tutoring. But nationally, right, only 8% of students received anything that would be considered as defined just before by the criteria of high dosage tutoring. Right, so this is a major concern, right? Only 8% of kids are getting tutoring. Well, you might say, well, maybe only 8% of kids need the tutoring. Well, we know from the recent NAEP results that's certainly not the case, right? The most recent NAEP results that just came out a couple weeks ago, right, show that 39% of grade 4 students in math and just 30% of grade 4 students in reading are performing proficiently or at grade level, right? It's even a worse story for 8th grade students. 27% in math, 29% in reading are on grade level standards. And when you disaggregate the data by school, by economic disadvantage, the numbers are even more abysmal, right? Almost less than 20%, in some cases, 14% of 8th graders who are economically disadvantaged are on grade level, right? This is an existential problem, right? That we need to be, I think, more concerned about and act more seriously than we are. Now, before I turn to sort of the evidence, we also know that there was a significant relief package over the last, from 2020 to 2024. It just expired, as Jim was describing, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, right? And so what we've done is we've taken data from Burbio. I don't know if folks are familiar with Burbio data, but this is a sort of a boutique data collection effort, right, that tried to web scraped all the ESSER plans that were posted at the district level. And the data source that we used was from Burbio, had about 7,000 of the about 13,500 districts in the United States, covering about 80 to 83% of students. And what we show here is, again, in this sort of cyan color, right? I don't know what cyan is, but my colleague said this is cyan, right? That about 1,000 of those ESSER plans actually identified funds dedicated to tutoring, right? This sort of dark, this bluish color, about 2,500 plans called out tutoring as an education reform strategy, right, or acceleration strategy, but didn't identify funding. So about half of the 7,000 districts had some mention at least of tutoring, right? These gray districts had no plan or no ESSER, no tutoring mention in their plan, and these white colored, there was just no plan available, right? The point of this, in part, is to say we have terrible evidence, right, on the availability or the use rather of ESSER funds. And again, this was a 3-tranche funding relief package beginning in March of 2020. There were 2 tranches, March and I think in the fall of 2020, and then with the new administration in March 2021, that was the America Relief package, American Rescue Plan, sorry, which was 112 of the $190 billion of the ESSER funds, right? So the point is we just don't have good evidence. I've written about this even going back to the Great Recession under the ARA funds, the America Recovery and Reinvestment Act. There was no regulation requiring the monitoring of these funds. So again, just a note about, we need to think, and do better monitoring the data and the funds that are allocated in these efforts. All that to say, if we add up from this Burbio data, all of the ESSER plans that indicated funding for tutoring, we get about $2 billion. Though I think more accurate estimates come from Future Ed that show about $7.5 billion of the $189 billion went to tutoring. And I want you to sort of keep those numbers in mind, 7.5 to 8 million out of 190 million when we get to this sort of scalability node that I want to talk about in terms of the amount of money that it would take relative to what we fund K-12 education at annually, which is about 800 billion, right, to address the academic need that we're currently facing nationally. Before I move on, I just want to also note that the ESSER funds did have an impact on student learning. We know that from Tom Kane's work. We know that from Dan Goldhaber's work, which showed that $1,000 per pupil increased student math by about 0.008 standard deviations and about 0.005. You're like, what does that mean? That's like a week of learning, right? So very, very modest, but very consistent with pre-pandemic meta-analytic evidence on the effect of money in education, right? So as we think about the return on dollars, right, this is effectively the return on giving schools, in effect, unrestricted dollars, right? And so what we know and what we're building evidence at Accelerator on is what's the cost effectiveness of tutoring? How many additional months, or what's the improvement of student learning for $1,000 per pupil? We know it's much, much greater than just giving districts unrestricted funding. Okay. So what do we know? Well, evidence increasingly shows, right, that high dosage tutoring improves student learning more than any other educational intervention. So here I'm just mapping a few point estimates in effect sizes, right? So the tutoring estimates, 0.29 is from the Nick Howe et al. Meta-analysis of 89 randomized controlled trials that was published in AERJ in 2024. And the 0.42 is from a more recent meta-analysis from Matt Kraft and Beth Schuler and Grace Falcon Grace, that shows about 0.4 standard deviations. And again, a standard deviation effect size, the magnitude of that effect does vary depending on the grade and subject. So again, we're thinking about just the range in terms of standard deviation effects. Compare that to class size reduction. So the 0.13 is from the Angrist and Lavie sort of canonical paper on Maimonides' role in Israel, which said that if you've got above 40 kids, you've got to add another teacher. So about a 0.13 standard deviation effect, and 0.2 is from the famous Alan Kruger paper on class size reduction in Tennessee Star, which was in 80 elementary schools in Tennessee in the 80s, right? So generalizability is likely pretty limited there. Vacation academies, this is Beth Schuler's work, where during vacation periods, students were provided with extra instruction. So those are the magnitude, the range of the effects there. Summer school, this is some work out of Rand, showing the effect of summer school, 0.08 to 0.09. And this is some work from David Figlio and colleagues looking at extended school days in Florida. So again, tutoring works. Oh, sorry. Is there a question? Please, yeah. Yeah.
One question.
Sure.
I wonder whether this is comparing apples and oranges. Because summer school tutoring, I would expect, is for students who failed. Whereas some of the other tutoring is for students who were just a bit behind but would pass.
Yeah.
Not with a lot of knowledge, but they would pass into the next course.
It's a great question. So the class size reduction, vacation academies, and summer school are it's not tutoring specific, right? But it is additional academic instruction. And I think your point is right. So to the extent that the population of students being served varies, the effects may also vary, right? But on average, right, vacation academies and summer schools and extended school day, like tutoring, tend to serve students that are below grade level and have the greatest academic need. But it's an important point. I think it's also really important for us to understand among large scale RCTs. So these are RCTs that would, in some sense, approximate, right, what it would be to scale. And when it's more than 350 students, we're not talking about scaling at significant levels. But over 350 students, and in some cases over 1,000 students getting tutored, the impact of tutoring really converges around 0.2 standard deviation. This is from NICAL, this is from Kraft, and then my colleague Luke Kolmos and I did a reanalysis of the NICAL all study about the same thing, right? So when we think about the impact of tutoring, I really want to focus on this 0.2 standard deviations, given, again, the fact that when we grow the sample size and we think about scale, it's unlikely to realize 0.3 to 0.4 standard deviations. So what we did also was just take some data from the 89 RCTs in the NICAL meta-analysis to try to get a snapshot of what we know and where the gaps are in the evidence. And we plotted at the sort of grade, subject, and tutor-student ratio, the number of studies among the 89 in this NICAL et al. Study. That's in this sort of schematic on the right? And what we see is that the majority of studies are in literacy, in English language arts, right? Which reflects both the provider landscape. Typically, providers are literacy rather than math. There are many math providers out there, and the available evidence on those providers. Same result emerges when we look at the more recent Kraft analysis, which expanded the number of RCTs to 265, and found that 73% are literacy tutoring programs in elementary, right? So what does this suggest? It suggests we need more evidence on the impact in middle and high school grades of tutoring, and particularly in the math content areas. Okay, so I think I've got, about 5 or 10 minutes, Jim?
You're good, yeah, 10
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay, so let's turn to what we don't know. And I think for those in the room and those online and others, thinking about if there are research questions, like if I was a doctoral student in the room, I might say this is a great area for potential dissertation, right? And Lisa Sanbei-Matsu is in the room, and Sebra's doing a lot of work with us as well. So I think there's lots of resources here to think about understanding the impact of tutoring. So again, despite the extent of the existing evidence, right, on the impact of tutoring, there's still a lot that we need to know. There's a need for more research into the specific tutoring programs that improve student learning. For which students, right? What's the heterogeneity in the impact of tutoring across different students based on background characteristics and academic need? In what educational context in terms of the composition and resources in schools? At what cost, and we'll talk more about cost in a few moments, and what are those programmatic features, right, as I mentioned earlier, that may be most associated with student learning gains? So we think it accelerates that researchers and policymakers alike would really benefit from, and we're working with researchers, we're working with policymakers and providers to generate evidence on the following, right? Understudied student groups. We wrote about and we'll publish next week our 4th quarterly research note where we talk about one of our grantees, Reading Futures, which provides early literacy instruction to students with dyslexia, for example. Study design, as I mentioned, we need to increase the sample sizes so that we have a better measure of the impact of tutoring as we think about scaling tutoring. We need multi-arm trial. We're working with Lisa and the CEPR team right now on a multi-arm trial of an online tutoring provider where we're randomizing not just treatment, but the student-tutor ratio in which students receive treatment. Policy relevant outcomes, right? So many of the evaluations in these RCTs rely on more proprietary, outcomes that are not end of year state exams, which are mapped onto state learning standards or even longer term outcomes, right? Now, of course, we want to know, does tutoring impact students in the year in which tutoring happened? But do those effects persist or not is something we just don't know at this point. And finally, we need better data and more replication. Right, better data, particularly around what programs cost. And Accelerate in the last couple of months has released new work to guide folks and a tool on program providers and researchers on the collection of tutoring program costs and the generation of cost-related metrics like cost effectiveness. And we need replication trials. In fact, Accelerate right now is supporting a replication trial with one of our providers, Air Reading, which is a virtual tutoring provider for early literacy. So as we think about, and just closing in the next couple of minutes, what research questions and what research opportunities do we at Accelerate see going forward as important, and what are we supporting? So to fill these gaps, right, we need to really build evidence around program design, as I mentioned, right? Modality, right? Where can we generate the largest effects for the greatest return on the dollar? Is it through virtual, hybrid, in-person models? Which tutor types matter the most, or do they matter differently? Teachers or volunteers or paraprofessionals, right? What about student-tutor ratios, right? To what extent can we vary the ratio, right, and generate cost savings without any loss in student learning? What curriculum materials? What about dosage? And then the interactions between program design features. One of the evaluations that we supported in the 23-24 year was in the HIP Indies middle school, grades 6 through 8, where they randomly assigned not just student-tutor ratio, 1:2 or 1:3 in their in-person math middle school tutoring program, but also for the 1:2, those students got 2 days a week. And for the 1:3, those students got 3 days a week. So interacting dosage with student-tutor ratio, again, to try to get some traction on, can we scale and can we minimize costs while maintaining quality? Focusing on cost and cost effectiveness, right? This is the issue of cost, particularly in the education space, when we think about impact, tends to be absent. Why do we do these impact evaluations and say almost nothing about the cost of the intervention itself? Right? So we need more information. And again, Accelerate has developed tools now to work with providers and researchers to collect tutoring provider costs, right, in a very itemized way to then match to estimates of impact and effectiveness, right? So what is the cost and the cost effectiveness or the return on the dollar invested in terms of student learning of specific providers? How does cost and cost effectiveness vary across providers on average and by providers that have different program design features, right? All of this driving towards understanding the return on investment of different tutoring providers. And as I mentioned, Accelerate will be launching our first call to effective technology grant focused on AI-enabled tools, right? Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of those tools in the market, right? To what extent does AI facilitated versus AI supported tutoring support teacher instruction, tutor instruction, and drive learning, right? As well as providing instructional feedback and coaching. And then how do these models operate in different educational settings and contexts? So just quickly before I turn to the last note on scale, right? Just some sample research questions that we're pursuing and working with our partners to pursue, right? So first, does the impact of tutoring vary as a function of specific features of tutoring programs for different students in different grade levels, right? And for students with different background characteristics. And as we've talked about already, as I've mentioned, how does program design features interact, right, to impact student learning? And how does it vary across students with different background characteristics? We need more information on cost effectiveness, and that's one of the primary research focuses of Accelerate going forward. What is the cost per pupil and the cost effectiveness, the return on the dollar invested in tutoring of specific providers, and how does that vary across providers? And then finally, in the AI space, right? What is the impact of AI-enabled tools and tutoring on student learning, right? Does AI-enabled tutoring support more efficient and effective instructional feedback for tutors and for teachers? And how does the cost and cost effectiveness of AI-enabled tutoring compare to human tutoring? So some of the things that we're really thinking about, working with our research partners and our provider partners and our district and state partners to understand the design, the cost, and the AI landscape. So finally, a note on scalability. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I talked to Jim last week. Jim said to me, well, what's it going to cost to scale this thing? I said, all right, let me sit down and actually try to write something out. Very rough, but just to get us thinking, and as we turn to the sort of questions and discussion, I want to sort of motivate this a little bit. So what are the parameters here? So what's the student need, right? So we can think about this in terms of the count of students who may be below proficient, right? So nationally, that's 33.5 million students of the 50 million students nationally. Again, this is something we should all be very concerned about. What's the count of students who are below basic, right? That's 16.5 of the 50 million students. So that's one parameter. How many kids are below proficient? How many kids need academic acceleration and remediation? Second, what's the impact of tutoring, right? We talked about in larger scale evaluations, the impact converges around 0.2 standard deviations, which corresponds to, on average, about 3 additional months of student learning per year. How do we measure the duration of academic recovery? Well, on average, and I was talking to Tom about this the other day, and then more recent reports are showing this from NWEA, students on average are about 4.5 months behind. So about half of a grade level equivalent behind, which corresponds to 1.5 years of tutoring that would be necessary to recover that 4.5 months of lagged student learning. And finally, what's the cost per pupil, right? So with those parameters, we can get the total cost, which is just the product of student need, the duration of academic recovery, and the cost per pupil. So this, again, simulated cost of scaling tutoring. Again, thinking about the parameters, what we would need, right? Can we drive costs down? Can we move quality up? Obviously, that's going to change the distribution here. But here I've got the total cost in billions of dollars, the cost per pupil from 0 to 3,000. And typically high dosage tutoring programs range between $1,000 and $3,000 per pupil. So that's clearly one parameter we need to drive down. The orange line is the distribution for kids, those 33.5 million kids who are below proficient. And this gray is the 16.5 million kids who are below basic, right? And so you might say, well, what does this mean? These dollar figures mean in terms of the total budget that we spend annually on education. So here I just plotted the same distributions, right, to show that, at $1,000 per pupil, right, if we focused just on the kids below basic, that's about 3 to 3.5% of the $800 billion a year that we spend, which corresponds to about $22 or $23 billion a year, right? So again, 3 to 4%, if we could get the price point around 1,000 or even more, right, should not be, I think, insurmountable, given we spend $800 billion a year on public education. So all that to say, just to get us thinking about what are the factors that we need to think about as we think about scaling effective tutoring practices to reach as many students as needed. So I'll stop there. And again, thanks for taking some time. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Matthew.
Yeah.
Why don't I'll start off with a question, but then we'll open it up for folks in the room and then try to bring in folks online. So one variable, I guess, that wasn't necessarily on the list of things that you were looking at, but you may have actually done some of this work already, is that tutoring exists within sort of the context of the larger school day, instruction, curriculum, et cetera. And the extent to which those two things are operating in synchronicity or are at odds with each other, like, the tutoring is thrown as a band-aid to bad instruction or to bad curriculum, or they're not aligned. I guess my question is, to what extent do those factors need to be lined up?
Yeah.
For tutoring to be successful, or at least to maximize its impact?
I think it's really important, right? And we see it accelerate, tutoring being a part of a multi-system support structure, right? Where we've got tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 instruction, and tutoring being a key piece of tier 2 instruction, right? Where it's built into the school day, it's a predictable feature of academic recovery and, again, remediation for kids who are struggling in tier 1, right? So again, what we're trying to do, as you know, Jim, is building these structures within districts at the state level even to try to support tutoring as part of a multi-tiered system of support for kids.
And I would just to focus on science of reading in particular, and science of reading more specifically. I talked about the proposal for expanding tutoring funding in Massachusetts. A lot of that would probably go towards reading. I think a lot of it's going towards reading nationally. But with a focus on those schools that have adopted science of reading curriculum and professional development, as opposed to trying to drop it into schools that have not. So I guess maybe it's more hypothesis than research findings, but that 0.2 gain, is there a theory that might say that could really go up significantly or meaningfully if both curriculum and tutoring was pulling on the same board?
That's a great question. I like to say that the effective tutoring is not the effective tutoring. The effective tutoring is the effective tutoring compared to what the kids not receiving tutoring are getting, right? So I think it all depends on what that counterfactor or what that comparison is, right? So if it's the case that the alternative supports that non-tutored students are getting, right, that's tied to science of reading, right, that is really driving learning standards and trying to meet those standards, even for kids that are, close to or above proficiency, that might ultimately sort of dampen even a very impactful tutoring effect, right? But I think that there is the potential to say, well, how do we improve quality and the return on tutoring? Well, if we're focusing tutoring on the kids that need it the most, we know the marginal return to tutoring is going to be greater. And this gets to the gentleman's question in the back as we think about what's the relevant population of students that we want to target. Is it all kids below proficient? Or do we want to start with the kids that need it the most, right? And I think if we started with the kids that need it the most, and again, it's an empirical question, the effective tutoring may be even greater than on average from what we see from 260 plus RCTs, right? Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Let me open up. Why don't you,
Please.
Yeah, very, very interesting. One question I thought you may touch upon when discussing scale is about the labor market for tutors, right? So one, I'm sure very simplistic way of thinking about tutoring is a combination of, for some part of the day, you do small classes and you presumably pick some really good teachers, right? And those are the tutors. And I'm sure there's some of that going on in a lot of the studies in these big meta-analysis, right? But this becomes even more of a problem, right? As you scale, and this is one of the elements in the toolkit. So how do you guys think about that, right? Where are these tutors going to come from? Because presumably, of course, you're telling us that there's not enough data about cost, but presumably one of the hopes is that they're less costly than a typical district teacher, but at the same time be very effective.
No, this is a great point, and obviously a key sort of omitted parameter from my very stylized example, which is, is the labor market sufficient to support scale, right? And in the same way that we know that we've got, a dearth of qualified teachers, right? We know that, and Matt Kraft and others have written a lot about the prestige of the teaching profession over time. It has declined. Folks are not entering the teacher workforce. So we do have to think creatively. So there's interventions that rely on paraprofessionals. There's interventions that are focused on improving the tutor to teacher pipeline, right? Leveraging tutoring as an entrance point for college students and folks out of college already in the labor market to enter tutoring or to enter teaching through tutoring. And then also thinking about what are some, other approaches on the tutor supply side that could support scale, right? Through AI-enabled tools, through virtual tutoring. Many of the providers that we support are virtual providers that leverage not a local, but a national labor market, right? To provide tutoring through virtual instruction. So But your point is, tell me your name, I'm sorry.
Carlos.
Carlos, your point is really important about thinking about what is the supply of not just, human tutors, but the new tools that can help support scale. Yeah, thank you.
How do you factor students who are very efficient? I know you said you're a teacher. I used to be a teacher. Like, there's a group of students, sometimes they call them
bubble kids.
the bubble
Yeah,
kids
yeah, yeah.
who have just reach proficiency, but they still need additional support
Yeah.
to make sure that they can sustain that growth over a long time. So how do you figure that into your research?
No, it's a great question. And what we also know from, proficiency-based accountability systems like No Child Left Behind is that when, left to their own devices, teachers will very deliberately target those bubble kids, right? And we know, at the expense of the lowest achieving and certainly the highest achieving. So I think it starts with thinking about what's the population we need to serve, right? And again, thinking about interventions and, many of the state and district partners we work on prioritize need, right? Student need. So it's typically not the kids at that bubble, but it's the many kids that are well below the proficiency benchmark. But I think, I think about it as both academic remediation and acceleration, right? In the sense of a value-added framework, right? How much value are we adding to the growth of the lowest performers, as well as all students across that distribution? But again, I think as we think about trying to scale what is a scarce resource right now, we do have to be more deliberate to really target the greatest need. But also thinking about, to Jim's point, what are the other systems we place in schools that are next to or in addition to tutoring that are providing support for kids who may be on the bubble, but definitely still not proficient, right? In cases where tutoring is a more limited resource in those schools. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for presentation.
Thanks.
So my question is, when you're talking about the research, you see that there's lack of research in the higher grade and in math, but intuitively, I'm thinking measure the performance of math should be easier compared to literacy. So I'm curious about what's the obstacle for this lack of RCT. And
That's a great question. So, right, it's a supply side question. Why do we see fewer providers? The one of the largest, or at least most well-known math tutoring organizations is Saga, which came out of the Match Charter Network, and they do early high school math tutoring, and it had really big effects in Chicago public schools. But it's a great question as to why we have a more limited pool of providers. It could be, to Carlos's point, right? There may not be the labor market of tutors available to tutor folks in geometry or algebra compared to early literacy or even early grade math, right? But it's a great question, which again, I think we need to know more about. What are the barriers that may constrain the supply side? And it's one of the things that we're focused on going forward in our next set of grant making is around providers who are focused on middle and high school math in particular, because we know we need more evidence on that. But again, this is an important question as we think about that work, thinking about with our research partners, what can we say about the labor market and the supply side that may constrain, again, the availability of tutoring services for kids in high school grades and particularly in math content areas? Thanks. Yeah.
Full disclosure, I'm a retired secondary math teacher who, since the pandemic, has been a volunteer tutor for math high school students in Cambridge and also through the METCO program, voluntary lesson program. And what I don't understand is, why is scaling tutoring going to be cost effective, and why should that be a goal? It seems to me if students are 4.5 months, you say, behind for whatever reason, that should suggest a massive investigation of curriculum. And the knee-jerk reaction of schools is to add something on, gobble up more and more of students' time, take away their play, take away their free reading, take away whatever you can take away to move them over to a supplemental program that may or may not be effective. I think it would have some effect, but it seems to me that it would be much more logical to have a huge investigation of curriculum as a first move.
And I think it's a great question. I think we're seeing that, as Jim mentioned, with reading curriculum, particularly in the last couple of years around the science of reading,
Not math.
and not with math. So I think also these are not, mutually exclusive, right? I think we can do both. The extent to which we could identify areas or gaps in the math curriculum, both in terms of the content and the instruction, right? That we think could help drive and reduce learning gaps is certainly one thing we should be doing. But in the meantime, we also, I think, have to be considering what are the additional supports for the kids that right now, instead of waiting in 5 or 6 years, that are behind.
But given this, the very serious point.
Yes.
Which can't be ignored. And given the money problem, which can't be ignored, I wonder what is going to be more cost effective and more likely to get, say, what limited federal money there might be or state money.
No, it's a great question. I mean, in part, we can say, well, what's the return? Over time. And we can embed academic supports for students who, even when we improve the average distribution, the average quality of teachers over time, still need academic remediation. So I think this gets to Jim's question about trying to fit tutoring within the ecosystem of teaching and learning that's happening in schools. But it's an important question. Thanks. Yeah.
So, I'm a mom, I have 3 kids, when my older daughter was in 8th grade, she was doing very well, etc. She was in the accelerated Algebra 1 course. I didn't pay attention at all to.
It's all coming out of this box. Okay. So.
So everyone in her accelerated group, they tested into high school, right, to see if they were going to go into geometry or algebra 2 math or whatever it is. So, so no one in her class passed the algebra 1 test to go into, the next class, which raised the bar for me, right? And I'm like, hey, didn't you just take algebra 1 like over 2 years, like 7th and 8th grade, right? So I did this little investigation on my own. Sorry to take a little bit longer. But basically, I learned that the teacher had, so this was under Common Core, out of a textbook with 10 chapters. By April, they had only covered through chapter 2. So that was the problem, was that they hadn't actually covered the material, but no one was paying attention. So I brought this up to the principal. So this was a small Catholic school. Nobody cared. They're like, well, this is the pace that they were going. This is it, okay? But I raised a huge stench about it and said, hey, but shouldn't the kids get tutoring, right? So that we can make up for this over the summer or whatever. They all said no. So I called around to all of the schools in the diocese to see where they were, right? So I found actually a similar pattern that none of the teachers had completed the full curriculum. Most had completed at best half of the curriculum. Then I called all of the public schools in our area and I spoke with all of the math teachers. In the public schools, they had completed approximately 75% of the curriculum. So I think that his point is very valid, that a lot of schools are not necessarily completing the curriculum that's set by the textbook or by the school. I mean, the schools will often say, okay, this, here's our plan. But where is the accountability? And I do think that that's important, especially with the loss of learning during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of questions there. There's a sort of private versus public sector question. You mentioned accountability, right? Which tends to be, as you know, more school specific in private settings versus more sort of district or state specific in the public settings. But I think certainly if, if you're completing only 20% of the curriculum, you're unlikely to see students succeed in terms of the end of content area exams. But again, even conditional on, schools, following the scope and sequence of the curriculum and completing the content, right? We know that the gaps in learning don't just appear in 8th grade, right? So we know they're appearing earlier, right? So is it a function of, the more, limited instruction or limited coverage of the content area, and or a function of other factors that are driving gaps in student learning that require remediation, again, even in early elementary grades. But there's a lot, I think, happening in the experience that you're describing. Yeah.
Mike, do we have any questions online?
Sure. There's one from Pat Wolf. Do you expect that quality might decrease as tutoring scales? If only 1/4 of students who need it are getting it, and some of that isn't high quality, if you deliver 4 times tutoring, how can you maintain quality?
Yeah, so Pat from Arkansas is also one of our research partners. So Pat, thanks for the question. I think, again, it's an important question. How do we maintain quality when we scale, right? We think about, if we're drawing increasingly from, the left tail of the performance distribution among available tutors, that certainly may affect quality. But at the same time, as we think about, the role of HQIM and more scripted curriculums in tutoring programs, right? We can think about ways to, potentially guard against declines in quality as we scale to reach more students. But I think that there are lots of questions, lots of empirical questions that are open there around what's the effect on quality as we provide services to more and more kids. And we see that again, as to Pat's point, when we disaggregate these randomized control trials by the study sample size, right? So the question is, as we scale and scale, does it go down to 0.1, right? But again, as we think about 0.1 standard deviations, what's the opportunity, what's the counterfactual, right? Is it some other intervention, right? So we still know 0.1 relative to just giving districts $1,000 per pupil is, in some cases, 5 to 10 times the effect of just providing unrestricted aid. So again, I think we need to think about what's feasible, but also what's the counterfactual or the opportunity costs associated with dollars that may be dedicated to scaling tutoring. Thanks, Pat.
Just make one quick comment just about, you mentioned $1,000, and getting, thinking of that in the context of the data around the average cost per pupil for tutoring interventions. Just to keep the sort of making more apples to apples for people, that when you talk about $1,000 per pupil, that in sort of like additional, federal or state aid, that's $1,000 for all the students in a cohort or a grade, not the 1/3, 20%, whatever, who are receiving tutoring. So if you think about it in that way, the cost on a aggregate per pupil basis is more, like adding 6% or something like that to the elementary school budget rather than, a much larger number.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks.
Just a quick question, if there's no others, I can't resist. So I know this is one of the things that you are sort of asking for proposals for and stuff, but what's your take now, given that you probably see them day in and day out with regards to AI-enabled tutoring and what it may do to this whole discussion of scaling with, something that may have small to zero marginal costs, right?
Yeah. I mean, some of them, and we've supported tech-enabled providers and continue to do. Some that come to mind are Oko Labs and Third Space Learning and others that are developing and pushing, I think, on the frontier of AI-powered tools. And I mean, what I've seen in terms of the technology in the last 6 months is incredible in terms of text and voice-based AI-enabled tutoring. And, again, do we want to put kids in front of more screens for more time? I think we need to be judicious about how we do that, but also I think we need to better understand whether these AI-powered tools, again, compared to human-based tutoring, generate similar effects, right? And that's really, I think, the next frontier of the evidence, right? Is as these AI-enabled tools come online, to your point, they do solve in many ways the labor market question. But the extent to which they could drive outcomes is still very much an open question, right? And I think that's where we're pushing with our new support going forward with the call to effective tech and really trying to get some traction on this empirical question, because that's going to be the key, I think, to scale. Thanks.
I have a question, I think, related to this AI point. So I previously was an elementary literacy tutor. And I don't know for sure, but I suspect that a lot of the effect on literacy outcomes for my students was the result of having like a stable, positive adult relationship in school that maybe they didn't have at home, or like a cheerleader in school, or someone that an adult you could interact with personally at school. And so I wonder, I know that, we're always looking for more research on kind of the mechanisms of why tutoring has an effect, but I have a sense that moving tutoring into an AI space you're going to lose a lot of the kind of like human connection and relationship effects that you would get from these other tutoring.
No, I mean, it's certainly, I mean, again, I think it's an open question, but it's certainly a possibility, right? To what extent, does some of the effect of tutoring, whether it's in person or virtual, synchronous with a live human, generated by the predictability and the relationship that the student is having with an adult that is another adult, not their teacher, maybe not someone at home, versus if you replace that adult with text and voice-based chatbots or AI bots, does that affect some of the the interactions and then ultimately the impacts that the tutoring has on learning? It's a great question, and we don't know, but I think it's an open question, and one that I think is part of what we're trying to understand. Yeah, thank you.
We got another question on the chat.
Kind of related to that, not the AI angle, but one viewer, Katie Garness, asks, it appears research on provider effect is limited. Have there been initiatives or studies on upper grade students tutoring lower grade students?
Yeah, this is a great question. There's really very limited evidence on the peer-to-peer tutoring, though I think, thinking about the labor market pool, it's another sort of, I think, relatively untapped resource. And we could think that there's probably sort of co-production benefits for both the student that's getting tutored and the student that's doing the tutoring, right? I mean, for me, at least, I know for others, as a teacher, and even, when I was a student working with classmates, I'm learning, well, I have to know if I'm going to provide some instruction. So I think that's something, and we've got, more limited evidence on the peer-to-peer tutoring. But it is an important question and an important potential resource as well. Yeah.
One question that is related to the state's leading recovery grant. Looking at some of the Pulse survey data, it seems the South is doing a lot more tutoring than just about anybody else. Any sense for why that's so? Whether they're just throwing money at a problem for some reason, or whether they've sort of are leading the leading edge of change and improvement on this front?
I think in some sense, both with science of reading as well as with tutoring, some of our southern partners like Louisiana and Arkansas has the LEARNS Act. Louisiana has increased in its legislature state aid dedicated to tutoring. Seem to be focused very much on core skills and core learning through both the science of reading and these additional supports through tutoring. Now, I know here in this state, Massachusetts recently got rid of the end of high school exams. So this is happening in states that, right? I know Washington, similarly, New York, in a couple of years, I live in Brooklyn, will be getting rid of the regents for high school exit. So I think there is, I don't think it's clear strictly on sort of a red-blue divide, but there's very much a distinction between accountability, right, and moving away from test-based accountability in other places. I think that's clear, and to your point, Jim, it seems to be centered, again, in places like Louisiana and Arkansas, which, and Mississippi even, where we've seen significant improvements as measured by the NAEP in these states, whereas in places like Massachusetts and Washington, we've not seen that. So I think it does get back to this question of the role of accountability, particularly test-based accountability, and ways of addressing core competencies in instruction and teaching and learning that may be sort of less in vogue in places where we tend to live. Where I live, where you live, yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Anybody else online, Mike?
I can ask one more. How are you distinguishing between small group instruction, which is fairly common practice, and tutoring, if tutoring can be done during the school day by teachers?
So the distinguishing between the tutoring itself and what students who are not technically in the tutoring groups are receiving, yeah. So this is a really important question, right? Because, and it gets back to my point that, you know, the effect of tutoring is the effect of tutoring compared to something else that students not being tutored are receiving. And I think one of the things that we're working with our research partners like CEPR and Lisa and Tom Keane and others is to really try to measure and understand the context, these counterfactual or control group comparison context. What is business as usual, right? And measuring business as usual, right? Is it small group instruction? Is it, you know, teachers are working on a more individual, you know, shorter basis with students while a group of students are being tutored in a more formal setting? Again, knowing what those business as usual conditions are, which we really don't have a good sense broadly, is I think key to understanding the effect that tutoring has. Yeah.
Maybe just one last question. So you're measuring impact on test scores or let's say reading or math performance. Have any of the research projects been assessing the extent to which students may be sort of avoiding referrals to special education or other kinds of things which can both you know, sort of shift their academic experience going forward, but also add additional cost to the school? I mean, reading in particular in elementary school tutoring, if there's a connection between effective tutoring early that leads to fewer dyslexia or other learning disability diagnoses, in theory, there's like an economic case you can make that, oh, okay, early intervention means savings that you can actually put in the bank.
It's a great question. As part of our evaluation work, we are focusing primarily on the reading and math test scores, but I think this is clearly an important question, right? What are sort of like the potential positive spillovers of tutoring beyond just test scores? We don't really have, you know, evaluations that are focused on things like social emotional learning, or like you said, identification for special education, or students who are being moved out of bilingual or ELL instruction, right? Because they're becoming competent and proficient in reading in English. So again, I think it's an important question. And it is one of the things that sort of at this point, beyond the sort of strict focus of our achievement specific lens. But I think it's an important question that should be pursued. Yeah.
All right. With that, Matthew, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody.